This is the Ralph E. Wynn Popular Person Program coming to you from Richmond, Indiana, Public Access Station, Channel 21. Today we have a distinguished guest who came from Piqua, Ohio. He's going to introduce himself as a former teacher of Afro-American history. And then I would hope that you would stay with this program because you're going to be influenced by a very warm-hearted person. As a teacher, and as many of you have known, teachers that you would like to emulate, that you would like to remember. So our gentleman and guest is Larry Hamilton, Piqua, Ohio, who has written 2 books. And as you think about these 2 books, which incidentally I've read and hope that you will also do the same, as you think about these 2 books, I'm going to ask Larry how he happened to have done research to write 2 books. Would you tell us about the books and their titles, please, Larry?
Sure. Ralph, first let me thank you for having invited me to Richmond.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate the opportunity that you extended to me to come and address a group at the First Friends Church here in Richmond, Indiana. And you've been gracious in terms of your outreach to me and your effort to kind of push me on down the road here in promoting my 2 books, Lucy's Story and Between Two Sons. But you asked the question about research.
Yes.
And basically, the research stems from a meeting that developed in 1975 while I was attending Wright State University working on my master's degree.
Yes.
And at that time, I stumbled into the Belinga Cultural Center in Dayton, Ohio, and was somehow placed on their mailing list, which resulted in me receiving a flyer about a Black History program, which was to be promoted actually in November. And it sounded interesting, and since I had taught African American history, I was familiar with the person who was going to be presenting that program.
Yes.
The person's name was, of course, Alex Haley.
Unusual.
Now, I was familiar with Haley from the standpoint of his work on the autobiography of Malcolm X.
All right.
But he was there in an entirely different capacity. He was there promoting his new book, and his new book was called Roots.
I see.
And that book was so awe-inspiring, and his presentation of how he researched his book
Yes.
was the basis upon which led to my own research discoveries and the formulation of an oral history with my grandmother. My grandmother, Ralph, was just like Haley's grandmother.
Okay.
And as Haley said, she filled him with all those, all that kind of information over a long period of time that he utilized in his research of Kunta Kinte and the whole Haley clan of descendants. So I was influenced greatly by the effort on the part of Alex Haley, and as a result, contacted my grandmother, which led to an oral history interview, and that was the basis upon which I launched my research and investigation
Fine.
into
Thank
family
you very
history.
much for that. Could you give us an idea of the location of where your grandmother lived at that time, or her parents? And secondly, give her a brief description for us, height and weight, just in general.
Well, I don't think that she would appreciate me trying to make a determination of her weight,
No,
even,
well,
even
ladies
though
are
she's
very particular
deceased.
about that.
But my grandmother and my family had come out of Kentucky and had made their way from Garrett County, Kentucky, to Gallatin County, Kentucky, and Warsaw area, and then from Warsaw up into Laughlin, which is where my grandmother was born, Laughlin, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati. And then from Laughlin, at the age of 3, the family moved to Loveland, Ohio. And that was about 1899. And that branch of my family had been in Loveland since 1899, but the Hamiltons themselves had been there long before. So we are long-term residents and native to Loveland, Ohio, which is a northern suburb of Cincinnati also.
You mentioned your last name being Hamilton. Can you bring in some other names, perhaps, of family names that may have existed prior to yours, and particularly as it applies to your source and research for your book?
Absolutely. Lucy's story, for example, comes from my great-great-grandmother, who was a slave in Estill and Madison County, Kentucky. And she was the slave of a man by the name of Wilson Sams. Actually, Wilson Sams was her progenitor. So he fathered Lucy, by right, I suppose that her name was the name of her father, and that was Sams. We have Sams, and then Lucy marries a gentleman by the name of Allen Ross. So we have Ross as a surname. We have Lucy's mother, who marries after slavery, and she marries a gentleman by the name of Thomas Wallace. So the Wallaces come into our family group. Lucy's daughter, Cynthia Ann Ross, marries the Reverend John W. Hannon. And so that's another line of the family group. And of course, my grandmother, a Hannon, marries Alvin Hamilton. And so that is where basically, our direct lineage comes down from.
You mentioned that you talked today at Yokefellow, and was there an interesting question asked or given to you at the end of your discussion with reference to names or with reference to other members whose families had similar travels?
Well, it's interesting. And wherever I go, it seems as if when I encounter people and they ask questions relating to my book, and if I mention one particular place or one surname, that's an opportunity for people to share with me their own personal experiences relating to something that I might have talked about. And so it was today, I was asked a question about the Detheridge family. And I remarked that I'm familiar with that name. That's a name, I don't even know if that's a specific surname that comes from another place, but I'm familiar with the surname in connection with Madison County, Kentucky. And I made mention of the fact that my families and the Detheridge family were members of a group called they worship within the colored Tates Creek Baptist Association. And this was a church group that evolved out of the slavery period and continued after slavery with the creation of a church that was referred to as the Mother Church in Richmond, Kentucky. And then from there, there were satellite churches or extended churches developed in Lancaster, Kentucky, in Boyle County, Kentucky, and then also up into Gallatin County, Kentucky at Warsaw, into Ohio at Laughlin, then to Loveland. And interestingly enough, I believe that there were churches also of that a group that formed here in Richmond and also in Indianapolis. So I believe
Yeah.
that, it was a fairly widespread
Yeah.
group.
You have touched upon two subjects, each of which is important. One is most of us recognize family history as a line, who begot, who begot. In what way does your book and its story differ from an itemized or cataloging of names? And secondly, you spoke about churches. Was there anything particularly spiritual or miraculous in your book that you could you address those 2 points, please?
Well, my family group has long had a spirituality associated with their behavior and lifestyle experiences. You might be referring to a story that comes out of the book, Lucy's Story, Right Choices But Wrong Still Left, in which my grandmother related to me
Yes.
that her grandmother
Yes.
had told her a story about her flight from slavery to freedom at a place called Camp Nelson. And it seemed as if my great-great-grandmother and her road travelers, probably her family members, did not know the way to this particular location, this Camp Nelson, but they knew and had heard that this was a place where they could receive protection because of the presence of Union soldiers. So they started out, their journey without knowing exactly where they were going, but they trusted in the Lord. And they believed that He would make a way. And on their way, they discovered this person who met with them, just mysteriously, miraculously appeared, and shared with them the path to Camp Nelson, accompanied them to Camp Nelson, and when they got within sight of Camp Nelson, this person suddenly, mysteriously disappeared. And I asked my grandmother when she was relating this story, was this a particular person that she would have described, that is my great-great-grandmother would have described? Was it a white man? Was it, a fellow, member of the enslaved that was also on their way to Camp Nelson? And my grandmother responded with, she said, the way my grandmother told me this story, it didn't really sound as if it was a man at all, but rather it sounded as if it was the presence of an angel that God had delivered unto them to provide passage to Camp Nelson. And so it was a tremendous story, and it's a great a story that is really kind of emblematic of our family group, that we've learned to take that first step based upon faith.
Thank you. We've heard the Great Migration, and your book kind of makes it anecdotal in the sense that it involves characters. Can you tell us why your book is called historical fiction?
Well, we are telling an important story.
Okay.
It's a family history narrative, and we have bits and pieces of the puzzle. And we are able to, through our research, recognize that the story has credibility and the story has authenticity. But how do you actually tell a story based upon a few places and a few things that we know that were authentic? So in order to tell the story, we of necessity had to create some means of sharing the story with readers. And because of that, we have to label it fiction, historical fiction.
In reading, I bought both books. In reading book one, you start out with Lucy as a young child and how she relates to her mother, and they move from one area to the other in terms of from the fields to the farmhouse. Could you just start us out with the introduction and how this particular story flows with Lucy's story? Before she had the vision, or she or some of her relatives had the vision that you spoke about.
Well, the book starts with a story that was another part of a family group, and it's a part of the family that I didn't mention, named Merritt. And I could also mention Clark family, because that's how the Hannons are descended from a slave master named Clark to Royston, Merritt, and then eventually Hannon. I could have and should have mentioned that because the initial story opens with Esther, my grandmother, giving a bath to her grandmother, Lucy. And Lucy has developed in age and is unaware of her unkemptness. I don't know if that's a word, but she needs help in terms of promoting a greater degree of hygiene, personal hygiene. But she's unaware of that. And it becomes my grandmother's role to look after her and point out to her the fact that she needs to be bathed. And that bathing, that effort on my grandmother's point to force her grandmother to undergo a bath results in her grandmother exposing her body, and her body is covered with whelps from a beating that she had received in her slave days. And that's a true story, but it didn't actually happen to Lucy. It happened to another one of my family members. And I wanted to share that portion of that slave history narrative with readers and wrapped it within the context of telling Lucy's story.
As the story developed and Lucy begins to travel, and you spoke about the mysterious stranger, was there a fort or a military post that they arrived at in the book?
Yeah.
And what's the importance of that particular military post?
Well, the place that they arrived at was, again, Camp Nelson. And Camp Nelson was located about 27 miles south of Lexington, Kentucky, in Jessamine County, right across the Kentucky River from Garrett County. And it was located high on the Palisades or the bluffs, of the Kentucky River. It was, heavily fortified just within a natural context. But Camp Nelson is important not only as a place that supplied many of the attacks on the Confederacy in the Tennessee area, but it's important particularly as a manumission center, an emancipation place for black men. A lot of people have never heard of Camp Nelson,
Yes.
but this was the third largest recruiting center for black soldiers in the Civil War. Everybody's heard of the Massachusetts 54th, and they know that that's associated with Boston. And everybody has heard some stories about Philadelphia as being a large recruiter of black soldiers. Well, the third largest recruiter of black soldiers in the Civil War comes from this recruiting area of Camp Nelson.
I see. Thank you
And
very much.
we're talking about thousands, almost 10,000 soldiers who were granted their freedom as a result of signing up to fight for their own liberation.
As the war ended and the characters continue their lives and fall in love and have children, is there some type of institution in addition to the post in which they received education?
Well, there is a gentleman that Lucy meets at Camp Nelson. And that gentleman is a man by the name of Reverend John G. Fee. And Fee was instrumental in engaging particularly black soldiers and these refugee slaves who had amassed at Camp Nelson. And he struggled to bring some comfort, some clothing, some sharing of food, and of course, being a former educator, a current educator actually during that period, and the founder of Berea College, Fee was intent upon teaching as many blacks the ability to read and write as he possibly could. So it's within that context that Fee eventually shares with my great-great-grandmother, we believe, the importance of sending her children to be educated at Berea College.
I mentioned that you too have been a teacher, now retired, and you taught Afro-American literature and its meaning. How could you relate that for our audience at this time and that particular career experience?
Well, I wish that I were a little bit more knowledgeable about literature. I taught black history, or African American history, of course, and that was an important step in terms of my own ability to make a difference in the lives of students that encountered my class. And at that time, there probably was very few cities that offered an African American history course in the state of Ohio. And by my way of analyzing the situation, I believe that my city, Piqua, was the only city that had an educational offering available to students over a 30-year consecutive period. And so we were able to relate a great deal and share with students at Piqua High School a great deal about black history. And unfortunately, the miseducation of many people who believe that they have a grasp and understanding of U.S.
Speaking
history.
of miseducation, you've heard the proverb, and I hope you would agree that a teacher's influence often extends with its students, not only for their lives, but into eternity. Having said that, could you relate how your book happened to have been written by a former student to showing the unusualness of that particular statement as it applies in your life and to the life of one of your students?
Ralph, I'm so glad you mentioned that and gave me an opportunity to, come back and to the fact that if you purchase my book, you'll find that my name is associated as the author. But I am not the writer. My writer is a former student. And this is a young lady who took my class of African American history back in the late 80s, and subsequently married, had children, and what I would consider out of the clear blue sky contacted me, but it's not one of those kind of fluke kind of situations. I believe now, in hindsight, that it was divinely ordered that she would contact me and ask about my presentation at Edison Community College, and wanted to attend, was unable to attend, but followed up and asked me to come and meet with her and share with her and her family what I had discussed in the way of my presentation about Lucy's story. And that led to a revelation of her dabbling in writing. And of course, it didn't occur to me right away, but over a period of time, I had one of those light bulb experiences and decided to submit her to another test. And the test was to determine if she had the literary skill capable of telling my story. And so I wrote a little paragraph. She responded to what I had written. It was all the equivalent of throwing a blue book at her. That's the old college, experience. I said, here's a essay question now. If you can, flesh this out for me, I'd appreciate it. And her response to what I had proposed as a essay type question was incorporated into the preface of Lucy's story, and obviously she passed the test. She's just been a marvelous influence.
In addition to her as being a female and also a marvelous influence, we know that any endeavor that a teacher takes in addition to his regular career to support his family involves his wife. Could you tell us something about your wife, her careers and her support, and her patience as you extended your influence, outside the community and all the way down to Kentucky?
Absolutely. Every successful man is being prodded and pushed, I believe, by a good woman. And I've been lucky and fortunate, even blessed, to have married my wife of over 40 years now. And she is a lovely person who stayed at home and raised our 4 children.
Good, super.
And
kids first.
yeah, my children, Lawrence, we call him Butch, Lawrence the third, and then Cicely, and Cicely is developmentally disabled, so that again tells you something about the level of commitment and support to family. And then Erica, and finally the baby in the family is Jonathan. Well, the 2 sons, the oldest and the youngest, are teachers, and they followed after their mother and father. Their mother, after she got all of the kids in school, went back and started taking classes herself, and over a period of some 10 years became a teacher herself. And so she's currently continuing to teach in Piqua, Ohio. She's an art teacher. And we mentioned the fact that she's an art teacher as we point out the books. The covers of my books, Lucy's Story and Between Two Sons, were produced by my wife. So she's a very talented person, and I'm just thankful that she has been willing to, give of her time to help in the promotion of the book. But before I go on, I would also like to mention to you, not only is there a family connection with my wife, but the name of the publishing company. I'm self-published, so I have to be self-promoting. Okay.
Yes.
So the name of my publishing company is Omavi and Asali Publishing, and those names are the names of my grandsons. Okay.
Right.
And my oldest son, who taught at the Afrocentric School in Columbus, chose Swahili or African-centered names for his sons. And Omavi, I love the names because Omavi literally means the highest gift from God. And again, it continues that theme of family, spirituality, and faith in God. So Omavi means the highest gift from God. And then the younger son was given the name Asali. And we learned that Asali literally means one who honors the ancestors. Now, I can't think of a better, choice in terms of naming a business that would tell or have an association with the narrative of family history than Omavi and Asali.
As you continue your story, it reminds me of two things. One, I think there was one character who wanted to be a minister, and I think he studied for the ministry by working with an older person, which I thought you might want to speak to as terms of, since the cause of your book is, again, a one-on-one with one's relatives, or in this case, with the character in the book, with one's neighbor, and you share information. Secondly, as the book ends, and I must say that any reader who gets it will perhaps wondering, why does it have to stop? Because the characters do reach a peak where they go through a struggle. And Lucy goes to or one of her relatives goes through a particular struggle in which she has the role of a single mother. And we know that in 2012, households led by females is a current thing. So in a sense, your book was predictive. Could you address those two things? The young man who studied his ministry and the struggles that the young lady had as the book ends, particularly in book 2.
Okay. In book 2, again, it's titled Between Two Sons, and I should point out the sons is spelled S-U-N-S. The subtitle being The Berean Experience. In book 2, Lucy's daughter, Cynthia Ann Ross, is courted by a rather sheepish kind of beau.
Yes.
And that gentleman happened to be my great-grandfather, whose name was John W. Hannon. At that time, of course, it wasn't Reverend, but that's how we address him now.
Yes.
It's Reverend John W. Hannon. And he was mentored, I guess is the right word, by older gentlemen within the Predestinarian Baptist Church. And one of those who were responsible for his tutelage was his great uncle.
Yes.
Actually, it was just his uncle. And his name was Charlie Merritt. And he was of the Laughlin Church of the Predestinarian group. And so each family member, it was, the old, kind of teaching axiom, each one teach one.
Yes, yes.
So
yes,
that's exactly what
yes,
was
yes.
taking place in terms of the biblical knowledge being transferred from one generation to the next within our family group.
Could you relate now how the one character suffered a certain family separation that caused her to rethink how she was going to live, and she had to rethink what type of anger and animosity she would carry within her?
Without giving too much away in,
Yes, I understand.
in the
Yes.
story,
Yes.
it's an incredibly tragic situation that families have to deal with.
Yes.
And sometimes there is the breakdown of the family unit.
Yes.
And we had such a story that came about in connection with, Lucy. And Lucy was troubled for no particular reason other than some of the issues that her husband had to deal with.
I understand, yes.
And a lot of those issues stemmed from his inability to promote himself as a man.
True, I understand that.
And
yes.
at the time, during the Reconstruction period, or what we refer to as Jim Crow, many black men had to swallow their pride and their manhood, and they suffered internally in their inability to be who they were intended to be. And as a consequence, that created some tension within the family group. But the key thing for us to recognize is that because of our dependence upon God and the desire on the part of these strong-willed women within our family group to be not just survivors but thrivers, they were overcomers, and they overcame some tragic situations, just as many women today
Yes.
who are faced with single parenthood
Right. Head of
are
households.
strong
Yeah.
willed people who are capable of a leadership role in parenting their children. But we obviously want to recognize the strength of the nuclear family unit, which we basically point out frequently
Yes.
as the reason for being as far as the family group is concerned.
There have been some books, as you well know, having been a teacher, that are catalysts for social change, one being Uncle Tom's Cabin and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and another being The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Your book joins the many, many books that have been written by teachers and non-teachers. And where do you think its place will be? And it's difficult to answer, but it's nice to predict. Pat yourself on the shoulder a little. And two, do you plan a third book perhaps as a sequel to these two? So two questions. One, in terms of its influence as it now is written, and two, the possibility of a sequel to keep the story going.
Well, Ralph, it's awfully kind of you to allude to Lucy's story within the legions of Uncle Tom's Cabin or The Grapes of Wrath and so forth. But in my neighborhood, they say, let's keep it real.
All right.
And but nevertheless, I hear people who have read the book say to me, this is something that is going to be more than an offering from a literary perspective, but they believe that it has the potential of a video kind of presentation as well, movie
Yes,
production. I've heard numerous people say that this is something that is yet to come, and it's interesting because we had the feeling that this was going to be a trilogy, and before I even started, and we've got Lucy's story, Right Choices but Wrong Still Left, and Between Two Sons, The Berean Experience. And there's a third book in the offering. And it's going to be available next year, hopefully before March of next year, because we're shooting for a release date in connection with the anniversary of the 1913 flood. And that's just one of the stories that my grandmother told me about family members. And we're going to, highlight that as a portion of the heroism that was unveiled in connection with that great, tragedy, particularly in Ohio. I'm sure that,
Yes.
also in Indiana as well.
You've spoken about having been today in Richmond, Indiana, and spoken to a group called the Yoke Fellow. Could you briefly tell us about some of the other public experiences you've had in presenting your book and in the locations and the places? Our listeners may be interested in the reception that others have given you in your book, in addition to Richmond, Indiana.
Well, just 2 weeks ago, I had the great pleasure of being invited to Berea, Kentucky. And there was a group called the African American Genealogy Group of Kentucky that had been formed, and I was extended an invitation to come to Berea, the place where my great-grandmother had attended college in 1888. And it was a real thrill on my part to have an opportunity to go to that place. But I've been a number of places that have afforded me the opportunity to share my family history story. And starting right in my own hometown of Piqua,
Right.
in February I was in my native-born place, Loveland, sharing the story, and was well received, and Cincinnati, and just many places, too numerous to mention probably. But I would like to mention a particular company or corporation.
All right, right ahead.
And we don't, at least I like to think that there are some corporations that have a real civic kind of recognition of duty and resourcefulness to the people who are their patrons. And I have been given an opportunity during Black History Month for the last couple of years to exhibit my book and conduct book signings in Kroger stores throughout Ohio, particularly in Springfield, and also in Piqua and Inglewood and Dayton, and all over, Loveland, all over the southwestern portion of Ohio. And I want to mention them because my father had also worked for 16 years as one who stocked shelves at night. It was his second job, so he was a hard worker. And,
Yes.
and again, it's a part of the tradition of my family. I've been blessed to, have strong willed women, but also great providers. And my father was one of those kind of men.
As a teacher in the classroom, of course, you're managing students and you're trying to motivate them, and you have high ideals. And most teachers are somewhat of the same, mind. What should be and what ought to be. Likewise, though, as you travel around and promoting your book, you're in a leadership capacity in which you're seeking to engage a volunteer list to read your book, to invite you and to purchase your book. And what are your symptoms of the leadership traits that young people, regardless of race, should have today too? And secondly, how about the leadership of those who are unable to attend college? Could you address the idea of leaders, both academically trained and leaders non-academically trained, and what kind of character and fortitude they should have as leaders?
Well, I'm not sure I can speak to that. That's a tall order, but I think all of us are given some leadership qualities.
All right.
And the important thing is for each of us to recognize what those, qualities and abilities are. in a leadership capacity and as a teacher, I have formulated, or actually I've been given an epiphany called the right concept.
All right.
That is very much associated with why I tell the story of this family history narrative. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the subtitle of Lucy's story, it's titled Right Choices, but Wrongs Still Left. And it's a situation where people strive to do the right thing. They do all of the things that society has asked of them, and yet, for one reason or another, society has created a situation where they aren't allowed to rise to the level of success that they should be capable of achieving. So a part of telling Lucy's story was the promotion of what I call the right concept and doing the right thing. Right stands for recognizing individual greatness in historical testament. And the idea is to recognize that there are some groups of people and individuals within those groups who haven't been given the kind of ownership identity, is what I call it, that they should be afforded because of their great service to their communities. And in many instances, we're talking about blacks, we're talking about women, we're talking about some religious, individuals also who, because they aren't Christian, for example, may not have been given due recognition for their service to the nation. And so what I advocate is that we honor and value and memorialize people for their contributions to society that aren't necessarily of a financial kind of association, but we extend to them ownership identity through public properties, the naming of public properties for these individuals. We should name streets and
Earlier,
bridges and
you
so
mentioned that in your research you came across some letters, I think, that individuals had written either to people you've known or to your individual parents. And that letter, or quotes from that letters, were put in at the beginning of each chapter. And I found those extremely well written. But there's one in particular at the beginning of Lucy's story by Frederick Douglass, and I'd like for you to perhaps expound upon this reading. For the heart of man, though morally right, hides many things from the mortal sight, which seldom ever come to light except upon compulsion. What did you think Frederick Douglass was saying there, and how does it apply to your particular book and used at the very opening of your Lucy's story?
Now, Frederick Douglass is one of the kinds of people that I'm talking about in terms of ownership identity and naming public properties for these kinds of individuals who have done so much for our society. He's a great hero of mine, and I hope that we will lift him up and recognize the accomplishments in pushing our society to be greater than what we idealize sometimes.
Yes.
Douglass was saying, you can't possibly improve society without challenging society.
All right, that's the compulsion.
Yeah,
Yes.
he there are a lot of people who want the rain, but they don't like the lightning and the thunder.
Yes.
And that's where Douglas was. He said, I got to bring the full complement of everything that's necessary for people to recognize that they need to come to grips with a lot of things that they otherwise wouldn't want to acknowledge. And so that's a part of what we're talking about in terms of recognizing individual greatness in historical testament. Frederick Douglass is a perfect example.
I understand, but as we spoke about leaders who perhaps may not be academically prepared and through their academic training as leaders, but natural leaders, and you spoke about anyone leadership if they recognize their inherent worth and their natural God-given ability.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes leaders, impatient, not disciplined by the rigors of an institution as you were in your classes, nor the stability of having a good family and a wife. And this expression applies. How would you explain it with your impatience? Life is not a race, but life is a deed or a journey.
Well, I explain it within the context of, as I look at my own life, I know that I have been prepared for this particular moment, and that all of the experiences that I have had in terms of being born in Loveland, Ohio,
Yes.
in terms of having been born to a mother who, with only a 6th grade education, would outwork anyone, and was a domestic working for other people's and cleaning other people's homes. A father who worked 2 jobs, as a postal clerk and as a person stocking shelves at Kroger at night. And even though they weren't always around, I was blessed to have, aunts and uncles living next door.
Yes.
I had a strong extended family group in terms of, trying to encourage me, direct me, even, sometimes punish me if I, misbehave. A grandmother, who was like the guiding force, the matriarch of the family, with her strong religious direction. She was my Sunday school teacher, So I have been blessed all, going to, from Loveland High School to Central State University, At Loveland, there were only, I think, 7 blacks in my graduating class. And then to go to Central State University, almost, 70% black at that time, is a majority historically black, college and university. And then having, the kinds of educators teach me what I had not known previously, like Ma Robinson,
Yes.
Dr. Lewis. I mean, there are so many people that I encountered that were responsible for, forming me, molding me into the kind of person that I have thus become. But all of those things are important and were a part of who I have become. And I know that that's the situation with a lot of people who, in hindsight, are able to look back and then know from whence they come.
As we think of this particular book and your being here at this particular time, we're about to conclude. And with this particular part of the season, would you have a few closing remarks for this particular interview? I'd appreciate hearing that. And I'm sure the audience would remember not only the beginning, but I hope the closing remarks from you, please. Larry Hamilton.
Well, I'm going to close, Ralph, with something I shared and closed with actually earlier today. I had received a link from another former student. I'm going to mention his name is Gary Williams, down in Atlanta, who's also a minister. Okay, and so I'm proud of so many of my students. But he sent me a link, and it was a picture. It was just a simple picture. And it was a picture of Christ. And he happened to be in a pastoral kind of setting with sheep in the background, but he was wearing a hood. And the picture was labeled, it says, Jesus wore a hoodie. And I was, struck by that in terms of some of the things that are taking place in our nation today. It actually flowed with something that I had referenced earlier in the week. And so I attached to that picture something that I had made reference to earlier in the week in Piqua at a city commission meeting. And I referenced Jesus Christ, this being Holy Week, as Lord and Savior, but I also referenced the fact that even 2,000 years ago, people had labeled him as a malefactor. And I said, within the context of looking at that historically, as we come to a contemporary setting, the malefactor label would today probably relate to somebody who was a suspicious character, someone who was thought to be a criminal, or someone who was likely to be up to no good, or a potential wrongdoer. That's what the malefactor, label meant 2,000 years ago. I think that those are, similar kinds of references.
Thank you very much.
Today.
Again, this is the Ralph E. Wynn Popular Person Program, bringing to you a gentleman from Ohio whose life in the classroom, whose research and retirement and writing a book, who told about his families, would indicate that you read not only for inspiration, but the book is an exciting story, one that you really hate to put down. We look forward to his third book, and if you want to buy a book, which will allow individuals to think about their past and an interesting and enjoyable historical novel, I recommend you to buy the books by Larry Hamilton called The Lucy Story and Between the Two Suns. This is Ralph E. Wynn signing out from WCTV, Richmond, Indiana.